Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has accused Russia of genocide after hundreds of bodies were discovered in the town of Bucha near the capital Kyiv. Images of mass graves and bodies showing signs of torture have sparked widespread international condemnation, with several EU countries now pushing for tougher sanctions against Russia. Moscow claims the killings were staged. Our next report contains some disturbing images.
Bodies line the streets of Bucha. Evidence of Russian atrocities coming to light following the liberation of this town near Kyiv. Ukrainian authorities say over 400 corpses have been found in areas retaken by its forces. A visibly shaken President Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited Bucha on Monday. He called on Russia to come to the negotiation table before it's too late. The longer Russia delays the talks, the worse it is for them. Because every day when our troops advance and reclaim territory, we see what's going on. It's very difficult to conduct negotiations when you see what they did here. The images out of Bucha have shocked the world. US President Joe Biden vowed to continue support for Ukraine and echoed calls by other leaders for an international investigation.
You may remember I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter is so it happened to Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight. And we have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial.
EU Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen said in a tweet the European Union was ready to send investigation teams to Ukraine. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov denied his country's culpability and called the death of Bucha a staged provocation. But the Kremlin's denials are becoming less believable, with everybody retrieved from the ruined cities left behind by its retreating army.
Let's join DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who was in Bucha earlier. Welcome, Nick. What did you see?
I saw a city in shock, a city that basically has been destroyed even before it could be fully finished. This is a very young suburb of Kyiv, lots of high-rise new apartment blocks that have been basically ruined while still under construction. You see a lot of people under shell shock, happy to see outsiders because they were cut off from the outside world for basically a month, but a mix of kind of hope, relief, and a very shocked energy. People very keen to tell their stories, to share what they've been through in the last few months. And we were at the main grave site next to a church. We believe, based on what people there told us, that about 100 people are lying there in several layers. Those right at the bottom that you can see in parts were just buried in what they were walking in when, as the locals told us, they were shot on the streets and then collected by neighbours and other Ukrainian locals who brought them there to get them off the streets. In the middle layer, you've got people who've basically been wrapped in a duvet or some sort of kind of bed cover, and then the top layer, people are in body bags. The locals told us that they'd tried as best they could to collect the passports or any other kind of ID that were on these people when they were found on the streets, to be able to reconstruct who they were and to let their next of kin know. We went to the cellar of a children's holiday camp where the Ukrainians say several people were executed with their arms tied behind their backs. The bodies had been recovered by the authorities today, but there were still blood stains on the walls, bullets lying around, clothes. It's a very extraordinary and disorientating place to be, and the most extraordinary because the rest of Ukraine and most people here living in Kyiv, like the journalists, were hearing the artillery shells in the distance. It's only 25 kilometers kind of direct line from downtown Kyiv, but yet they weren't able to get there for weeks and weeks and weeks. There wasn't a reliable phone or internet connection for a long time, so people were hearing this, were fearing the worst, were hearing awful things from people who managed to get out but weren't able to actually go and take a look at themselves until the last few days.
And it sounds from what you're saying there that there was no shortage of people there to witness what actually happened.
That's right, and the Ukrainian authorities are now being very proactive in trying to collect those eyewitness accounts. A few days ago, we were in another part of the Kyiv region where the Ukrainians have come back and retaken control in recent days, and as soon as you enter that region, you get an automatic text message encouraging you to report whatever you've experienced to a government website, and even on a local level, those people who'd collected the bodies talking about their attempt now to try and find those next of kin. They have lists of the dead that they found, and now they have internet. In part, for the most part, there still isn't internet or mobile phone connection in Bucha, but now trying to get back onto social media to then try and find the relatives of these people based on the names, based on the places where these people were found. One of the most kind of haunting things I heard today was from an older woman who had spent most of the past month hiding in her house, scared of leaving, and she talked about her son-in-law who had gone out to try and buy some food and been shot, but not only that, they'd found him fairly quickly, but they weren't able to recover the body for weeks because they were scared that if they went out onto the roads where it was dangerous, that they would also lose their lives. There were also talk of mines, supposedly bodies being covered with mines or booby traps, so that there would be a direct physical danger, threat to people's lives if they tried to get those bodies back, and that they'd only been able to recover that body in the last few days after weeks of that body lying on the road.
And a quick word about the Russian response, Nick. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, has dismissed this as part of Western disinformation, so presumably we're not going to expect any help from the Russian side in investigating these deaths.
I think that's a given, but for now it doesn't seem like they're advancing any alternative explanations as to how these people died. I think it's worth taking a look back to 2014 and the Donbass conflict and the downing of the MH17 flight over Donbass by what was then later established a Russian missile. Back then, the Russian government came up with new versions every couple of weeks that were then soon discounted or just ignored by their own side. But I think back then the tactic seems to have been to advance whatever it took, any kinds of kind of possible explanations to distract from the situation on the ground, in the hope that eventually people would lose interest and not bother following it up. But as we've seen since, the Dutch authorities have spent years investigating that, finding out down to the last person who was responsible all down the chain of command, and then now advancing those charges against people who will be tried in absentia. Obviously they're in Russia, they're not available to that court, but years of work did manage to achieve a clear picture of what happened back then in 2014. So I think the hope here in Ukraine will be that something similar will be possible.
OK, thank you for that, Nick Connolly. Well, Nora Love is Emergency Director at the International Rescue Committee and is currently leading the team in Ukraine. Welcome to DW. Have you, I wonder, been hearing, or had you been hearing rumours of these sorts of events as you went about your business?
I haven't been hearing, but IRC is shocked and appalled at this senseless killing. The conflict in Ukraine has gone on too long, and the international community must step up its efforts to find a diplomatic solution. The civilian lives must be protected. We can't afford to be a witness to another crisis like this.
Right. And how have the people that you've been helping reacted to this news?
So IRC, we're focusing with our local partners on stabilizing the health systems in eastern Ukraine. We're looking to support people with cash and basic needs and respond to the trauma as they move out of some of these areas further central and further west of Ukraine or even onto European countries. So we're focusing on that, working with providing pharmaceuticals, medical supplies and equipments, and reinforcing the health actors through technical support. We are trying to provide the services and the aid where it's most needed.
Because we had heard some terrible things about food and water shortages in the likes of Kyiv and Mariupol. So are things there now improving?
There seems to be some relief, but IRC calls with other actors to have free access and to provide the services to get these services back going in these areas. We want the rules of international law to be respected and just to have a sense of humanity throughout the country.
You say that you're calling for free access to the areas. What is hindering your access at the moment?
Well, there still hasn't been consistent free access to get convoys and other things like that. So we're calling on all actors to ensure that the humanitarian aid and access as according to humanitarian laws is allowed. So we just need people to respect those, including the protection of civilian lives and infrastructure.
OK, thank you for joining us. Nora Love from the International Rescue Committee.
Thank you.
Well, following the discovery of all those bodies in Bucha, Germany has declared 40 officials at the Russian embassy in Berlin to be undesirable persons, effectively expelling them from the country. France is also expelling a number of Russian diplomats. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said Germany would also boost its support to Ukraine's armed forces and tighten economic sanctions against Russia.
The images of the past weekend have once again highlighted a new, brutal dimension of this war, with the most serious war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that is why I made it clear over the weekend that we must not only close the remaining loopholes in the sanctions system, but that we must also intensively and rigorously implement this package. And with regard to Ukraine's self-defense, as I said, we will now also examine things that we have not examined before.
Let's get more from DW political correspondent Thomas Sparrow. Thomas, let me start with a simple question so we're all clear. Germany's call for even more sanctions. This is a direct result of these discoveries at Bucha.
Absolutely, and something else that's a direct result of the discoveries of those bodies and that massacre in Bucha is the decision to expel those 40 diplomats, with Germany's interior minister only a while ago stressing that it's all about securing Germany, maintaining official security, if you will, public security against Russian lies and propaganda, as Germany's interior minister stressed. And we've also heard the official Russian reaction to all that coming from the Russian embassy here in Berlin, stressing that they presented their view to German officials of what happened in Bucha. They rejected Germany's announcement of those 40 diplomats being expelled, stressing that Germany's unfriendly actions would not be left without consequences. We still don't know exactly what those consequences would be, but according to the Russian officials, they stress that this basically damages Russian-German relations even more and makes dialogue even more difficult between both countries. From a German perspective, clearly a decision related to what we are seeing from Ukraine, and also Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, stressing that this is only the beginning, that more actions are actually expected. OK, so what other cards does Germany have to play? Because, as you say, there are already stringent measures in place. Strengthening already existing sanctions is something that Germany's government, and Annalena Baerbock in particular, stressed. But that is something that Germany will probably not do unilaterally. That's something that Germany will probably work hand in hand with its European allies. What Germany is still reluctant to do, unlike some of its European allies, is to impose an embargo on Russian energy imports. That's something that the German government believes it would actually harm Germany more than it would harm Russia. And that's why Germany has said that it needs more time before supporting such a decision, that it's not entirely against it. What it's entirely against is doing it immediately, because that would certainly affect Germany to an extent that Germany certainly does not want. In fact, we've heard from German officials in the past say that that could lead to a recession, to mass unemployment, to poverty. So that's why German officials in particular are so reluctant to support an immediate embargo on Russian energy imports.
Thank you for that, Thomas. DW political correspondent Thomas Sparrow. Well, US President Joe Biden is one of many international leaders describing the events in Bucha as a war crime. Here he is talking with reporters after arriving in Washington on Monday morning.
You may remember I got criticized for calling Putin a war criminal. Well, the truth of the matter is so what happened in Bucha. This warrants him, he is a war criminal. But we have to gather the information. We have to continue to provide Ukraine with the weapons they need to continue the fight, and we have to gather all the detail so this can be have a war crime trial. This guy is brutal.
Let's join Christine Berzina, who's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where she also heads its Russia task force. Welcome to DW. What's your thoughts on this, given what we've seen so far? War crime or faked images?
It's very clear from the international press presence, for example, that went in to Bucha also over the weekend, that this isn't a faked massacre. And satellite footage also confirms, looking down on Bucha, where some of the placement of these bodies were, that this is, there's other verification of the authenticity of these images and of these attacks. And the gravity of these crimes is really glaring for the international community, for the United States, for Europe. And it takes the moral outrage to a new level. So the questions that come next are what to do about it. Clearly, the existing sanctions and even the Ukrainian military victories of pushing the Russians back are not enough to stop this kind of behavior. So how does the West signal to Russia and to the Russian military, to those soldiers who are choosing to make such horrible, devastating crimes against women, against civilians of all kind, that they are wrong? And that's where the new rounds of sanctions that are being talked about for later this week come into play.
Right.
But also, it's just so horrible.
Let me just interrupt there, because we'll talk about what possibly those sanctions might be. But what are they for? Beyond punishing Russia, is there a consensus about what these sanctions should achieve? Because if their purpose is to end this war, people might ask, well, why have they waited to turn the volume up to 10, as it were?
The purpose of sanctions is a frequent topic of conversation, and even today, Jake Sullivan from the White House, talking about the potential for new sanctions, was using the terminology of raising the cost, of having costs against Russia for its behavior. So it is important for Russia to see that these actions in particular are not only seen and said, that is sad, too bad, but they will have a cost to Russia immediately. There's a longer term question, which is the war crimes piece, which is what President Biden spoke about and many European leaders have, which is the necessity to collect all of this evidence and then take this to either the International Criminal Court or a different venue that is not yet decided, in order to prosecute President Putin for these war crimes. That is a longer term process. The question is, what can be done this week?
Right.
Now that this is clear, how do you punish Russia this week?
Right. OK, so we're talking about potentially extending the sanctions that are already on the table. But however this war ends, in a deal or by one side bombing the other to a standstill and claiming victory, does Russia then just resume its former position on the international stage, on the UN Security Council, and go back to business as usual?
It's very hard to imagine how, after behavior like this, Russia can resume standing in Europe or in North America. Yet there are many countries that abstained from voting against Russia across the UN General Assembly. China is backing Russia still right now. And so Russia does have relatively normal business with a few countries, India, for example, big countries, India, the United Arab Emirates, China, places that have very healthy economies and that are seeking cooperation. So there, yeah, I could imagine business as usual, but I find it incredibly difficult to see how there can be normal relations between Russia and Europe or North America, other global democracies that have taken a stand against Russia right now, given these horrific actions. Which is, the question, would sanctions of some kind come down? At which point, what would be the conditions necessary in order to normalize? But I think we are very, very far from that. And when you look to Russian history, Russia has not had a process for reckoning with its misdeeds in the way that other countries have. In Germany, the Nuremberg trials and decades worth of educational reforms and conversation have led to a kind of social readjustment and understanding about the problems with the Third Reich. After South Africa, after apartheid, there were truth and reconciliation councils that again forced talking about and understanding the violations that happened. And yet Russia, after the end of the Soviet Union, does not have a policy of looking at the Stalinist era or prior imperial era through the various purges and deportations and hunger campaigns and famines and murders and mass arrests. None of that has been denounced. Truly, instead, Stalin is glorified by President Putin. The imperial history is glorified, and the same rhetoric of cleansing society is back in play. So what would need to happen in Russia for some kind of future normal relationship is for there to be a societal understanding of the unacceptability of this.
That's very clear. I hope we get to talk again. Christine Berzina from the German Marshall Fund, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So let's look at the potential legal ramifications of these discoveries at Bucha. Professor Yvonne McDermott-Rees is Professor of Law at Swansea University in the United Kingdom. Welcome to DW. On the face of it, if what's been discovered in Bucha is what it appears to be, would that be a war crime?
Potentially, yes. I mean, it could even reach the level of genocide, war crimes or crimes against humanity. So these are three distinct categories of international crimes. Genocide is defined as any one of a number of acts, including killing, committed with the intention to destroy a national, ethnic, racial or religious group in whole or in part. So potentially, if it could be shown that these acts were committed with the intention of destroying the Ukrainian people in Bucha, then that could reach the level of genocide. Right. War crimes are serious violations of the laws relating to armed conflict. We've seen several potential war crimes. Obviously, everyone is entitled to the presumption of innocence, and this would have to be adjudicated by an independent and impartial tribunal. But potentially some of the things we've seen come out reach the threshold of war crimes, as do crimes against humanity appear to be applicable here. Right. So these are crimes committed against a civilian population as part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population.
And where in all that would Vladimir Putin be potentially culpable?
Okay, well, potentially, let's say theoretically we have a trial before the International Criminal Court. The ICC seeks to prosecute those who are deemed most responsible. And there are a number of modes of liability that are set out in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So these include ordering, inducing, soliciting these crimes to be committed. But importantly, I think in the case of Vladimir Putin, there's superior responsibility. So those who are in charge of an armed forces or others bear responsibility for the crimes that they've committed, where they've failed to prevent those crimes from happening or to punish them appropriately where they have been committed.
OK, but we're talking about the law, but we're also talking about politics. And if this war ends in some sort of peace deal, isn't the political reality that the prospect of criminal prosecutions is likely to be bargained away?
I think that's unlikely. Politically, I can't see the Ukrainian side agreeing to that. But I think legally as well, it's pretty problematic, the idea of amnesties for serious international crimes. So theoretically, perhaps, we might have some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as part of that, there might be some agreement that lower level perpetrators aren't prosecuted by the Ukrainian authorities. That might be problematic, though, because these international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, attract what we call universal jurisdiction. So that means that any country in the world potentially could try those who are deemed responsible for these international crimes. I think it would also be problematic in terms of the International Criminal Court. So even if that were an outcome of peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, I can't see the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court respecting such an amnesty. I think he'd be quite likely to say, it's my responsibility to prosecute those who are most responsible for the most serious international crimes, and that's what I'm going to do.
OK, that's very clear. Thank you so much for outlining that for us. Professor Yvonne McDermott-Rees from Swansea University.
Thank you.